The day Edward was born, January 15th, 2000.
This was the happiest day in Yancey Tolan's life. He was happier today than when he was 12 years old and hit 3 home runs over the fence in one game. He was happier today than the day his own father relinquished control of Tolan's toy company over to him. He was even happier today than the day over 2 years ago when he married the beautiful Terry Tolliver. This day, Edward Tolan was born. Edward would be the future of Tolan's toy company. As babies go, Edward was fairly typical, born of average weight and average height. Everything was pretty much average, except that Edward was born into a family that was far beyond average if your measure is wealth. Edward would receive the best education, the best health care, and the best clothes. He would go on the best trips and basically have the best of everything. It would have been very easy for Edward to become a spoiled bore, but fortunately Mrs. Tolan always kept Edward grounded. She loved her husband, but she knew that Yancey Tolan could be a bit overbearing. She also made certain that Edward was courteous and treated people with respect. Edward had the best traits of his mother along with the advantages his father could provide.
January 22nd, 2000. The day Ellis was born.
This was the happiest day in Thomas Daly's life, or at least tied for a day 8 years earlier. Exactly 1 week after Edward Tolan was born, Ellis Daly was born. Thomas's joy was much more subdued. He was both proud and worried. He worried about the hospital bills. He worried about Ellis's future. Rebecca assured Thomas that the Lord had a way of providing. With love and guidance, Rebecca knew that Ellis would grow up to be a credit to his parents. As babies go, Ellis was fairly typical, born of average weight and average height. Everything was pretty much average except that Ellis was born into a family that struggled to make ends meet. Ellis would receive a public school education, as most people do. Ellis had to depend on being healthy, with Rebecca serving as his doctor, since the family could not afford health care or health insurance. Ellis's clothes were purchased at yard sales and from thrift shops. He would never go on trips and basically learn to entertain himself. It would have been very easy for Ellis to become a complainer, but he was a happy child, living a safe and happy childhood. Mrs. Daly always kept Ellis grounded. She loved her husband, but knew that Thomas could be a bit hard on his son in an effort to prepare him for a brutal world. Rebecca made certain that Ellis was courteous and treated people with respect. Ellis had the best traits of his mother along with the realistic views of life espoused by his father.
April 2008.
During this time, there was a meeting in a rented hall for all the employees of Tolan's Toy Company. Mr. Daly was especially interested since he barely had any money left after saving all he could for a college education for his children. He was hoping for some relief. Maybe a union could force Mr. Tolan to bring employer-supported health care that the employees never had. Maybe Tolan's Toy Company could be persuaded to provide child care for its employees so parents could be free to find employment to help the family's finances. Mr. Daly was interested to hear that Tolan's Toy Company was making tremendous profits. Some of these profits went into the company for research and development, upgrading the facility, buying more modern equipment. But all this was accounted for in the profit numbers. Most of the money went back to Mr. Tolan and his stockholders. No one wanted to give money back to the worker. That was just not practical. Mr. Daly was hoping the company would support a retirement program for its workers. If Tollins would contribute just an extra 1 or 2% for this purpose, Mr. Daly could free up some of his income for other things the family really needed but continued to do without. When Mr. Tolan heard about the union meeting, he became furious.
"Those ungrateful scoundrels!"
he would scream.
"They should be glad to be getting a paycheck every 2 weeks. Let's see how they feel about a union after I fire the rebel-rousers."
And with that, Mr. Tolan fired 12 of the most vocal advocates of the union and replaced them with new employees. Mr. Tolan felt it was cheaper to train new workers than it was to cave in to the demands of a union. With this, the others backed away from the idea of starting a union. Mr. Daly's hopes were dashed. Angela, now 15 years old, took Angela Angel off the shelf where she stood since she was born and pulled the string. Angela Angel said,
"I know what you are thinking, Angela. I do not believe this is a worthy wish."
How do you know if it's a worthy wish until I wish it? Angela Angel, I wish that Mr. Tolan would recognize the Toy Workers Union as the legitimate representative of his workers.
And with that, Angela Angel said,
"Angela, this is not a worthy wish. Put me back on the shelf."
Angela did what the doll commanded.
November 2009 through January 2010.
During this time, the Daly's family faith was severely tested. Ellis, now nearly 10 years old, came down with diphtheria. Diphtheria is a totally preventable disease that most children never get because there are shots children take to prevent it. In fact, schools will not let you attend without these vaccinations. Unfortunately, since Tolan's Toy Company controls the valley and everything there, including the school system, it was not unusual for this rule to be overlooked. Diphtheria causes a thick covering in the back of the throat. It can lead to breathing problems, paralysis, heart failure, and worse. Mrs. Daly could not help Ellis. Her doctor skills were no match for diphtheria. Mr. Daly took Ellis to the doctor, and Ellis was eventually hospitalized. Mr. Daly had to spend all the money he was saving, all his life, to get Ellis the medical treatment he needed. When it seemed that Ellis was not getting better, Mr. Ellis became frantic and irrational. He barged into Mr. Tolan's office and demanded that he provide the financial support for the best medical attention available to his son. Mr. Tolan became indignant.
"You've worked here for many, many years. If you wanted health insurance, you should have bought your own or gotten another job that had it. I am not your father or your keeper. It is your responsibility to look out for your own."
The arguing continued and finally ended with security removing Mr. Daly. He was fired on the spot. Now the family had no income, and Angela no longer had money for college. She would receive scholarships, but it was not enough to cover everything. Angela, now in her senior year, would be forced to go to work. That was not nearly the worst to happen. On January 25th, 3 months after Ellis contracted diphtheria, Ellis quietly passed away. The whole family was devastated and distraught. Angela's grief was inconsolable. Ellis had always been her loving responsibility. Angela, now 17 years old, took Angela Angel off the shelf where she had stood since she was born and pulled the string. Angela Angel said,
"I know what you are thinking, Angela. I do not believe this is a worthy wish."
How do you know if it's a worthy wish until I wish it? Angela Angel, I wish that Ellis was still alive.
And with that, Angela Angel said,
Angela, this is not a worthy wish. Put me back on the shelf.
Angela did not do what the doll commanded.
How could this not be worthy? This is the most important wish I could ever desire. You promised me one wish. This is the wish I want you to grant.
Angela Angel answered back,
I also said that I would only grant the wish if it was worthy. You must trust me to know what is and is not worthy. You are only a young girl and cannot possibly understand worthiness. But in time you will understand.
And with that, Angela put Angela Angel back on the shelf.